I'm very pleased to be here. I started as an education advocate focused on the issue of class size, but got very upset and worried about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, when I found out about this project, and it's taken over my life overwhelmingly like nothing else in many years. So I'm going to take you quickly through what I've learned, only in a very difficult fashion over the last year and a half, because as you probably realize, the State Education Department is not very forthcoming with information to parents and other groups. And in fact, really didn't want to talk about this at all. So let me see if this works. All right, so I'm going to take you through the quick timeline. In May 2011, the State Education Department sent a letter to the State Controller asking approval of a no-bid contract to build their state longitudinal system to wireless generation. Now, as you may or may not know, wireless generation is now owned by Rupert Murdoch and run by Joel Klein, who was the former chancellor in New York City. And at about the same time this story broke, so did the story of the scandals over in UK with the phone hacking of the Rupert Murdoch with a dead child's cell phone, et cetera, and stealing a lot of very private information. For that reason, and because of conflict of interest problems, many groups, including Class Size Matters and the State Teachers Union, decided that this was an inappropriate contract and started a campaign. And the State Controller, to his credit, did not approve this no-bid contract and said because of privacy concerns, they didn't want to have wireless generation on the having our children's most private data. And then what happened in less than 6 months later was that the state decided to give the contract to the Shared Learning Collaborative, and the regents voted to approve it without letting them know that the operating system for the Shared Learning Collaborative was also being built by wireless generation. And I've spoken to regents who said they would have never approved that if they'd known their involvement. But because no money changed hands at that point, the State Controller nor the City Controller had any right to register or reject the contract. Let's see. Okay, so did I go past? Yeah, so about a year ago, I'd been asking the State Education Department for this contract ever since I heard about it, and of course they never respond to my emails, so they didn't give it to me. So I decided that we had to take further action. So I called up a friend of mine named Norman Siegel, who's a famous civil rights attorney, and I said we need to have a press conference about this because we need to get our hands on this contract and we need to let people know what's going on because the state wasn't telling anyone. And so we had a press conference, we got some good coverage, and they sent the contract to a reporter who sent it to me. But in the letter that we released the same day, we said, we really think you need to hold public hearings. We really think you need to tell parents exactly what you're doing with this data, what the purpose of it is, who is it going to be shared with, for what purpose, and allow them to either opt out or consent to this. And the state at that point, more than a year ago, said they didn't need to hold any hearings because this was already public knowledge, what they were doing, because it was mentioned briefly and ambiguously in an agenda on a regent's memo on the website. And I can tell you at that point, nobody pretty much outside a very small circle of people knew what was happening. I started reaching out to school board members and superintendents and elected officials in New York City, both at the city level and the legislative level, and there was not a single person who had ever heard of this, and I must say that most people did not believe what I was telling them. I also crashed a shared learning collaborative, a learning camp in New York City where they quickly realized that I was a person of interest and took me separate, and this was run by the Gates Foundation, and I learned more from the woman who was running that camp than I'd ever learned from the state, including, yes, they wanted all our data, all our children's data, and they didn't think that parental consent was appropriate. In February, the Shared Learning Collaborative became InBloom Inc. It became a separate corporation. And then it kind of launched, it had its big first public launch at a South by Southwest conference in Austin, which is where a lot of the high-tech companies meet. And I finally got a national reporter to write about it, because all the other reporters said to me, first they said, no, it can't be happening. They can't be sharing personal information without consent. That would be illegal. You must misunderstand this. And I said, no, check it out. And then they'd come back to me and say, well, you're right, but what's wrong with that anyway? So Stephanie Simon of Reuters was the first person to believe me, and she wrote a big article, and it started causing a lot of ripples around the country. And parent activists took it up. I blogged about it. Diane Ravitch blogged about it too. And very quickly, it became such a controversial issue, and parents were so outraged that over the last few months, 8 out of the 9 states that were originally planning to share data with InBloom have pulled out. In April, Louisiana pulled out. In May, Georgia pulled out. Later that month, Reuters confirmed that Delaware, Georgia, and Kentucky had no plans to share data with InBloom, even though they had been listed on the website as InBloom partners. In August, the only pilot district in North Carolina pulled out. In November, an entirely anti-InBloom slate was elected in Jefferson County, Colorado, which was the only district that was participating. Even before they took office, the next school board meeting, they unanimously voted to ditch InBloom, and the superintendent resigned. And still that did not satisfy parent activists in Colorado. They went to their state superintendent and they said, we want you to sever all ties with InBloom so that no district can sign up even if they want to. And 1 week later he did that. And then a couple weeks ago, I was in Chicago doing a forum and a presentation to editorial boards, and within a few hours of my landing in Chicago, Illinois decided the issue was too hot, and they were withdrawing. They were going to make it purely voluntary on the part of districts, even districts with Race to the Top funds. And within a few hours, Chicago pulled out of the program. I've never had so much impact in my life in such a short period of time. And I can tell you, here in New York, where it all started, where we've had the most organized resistance on the part of parents, school board members, district superintendents, legislators from both parties, local elected officials, our state is absolutely the worst state in the country when it comes to student privacy. We have made no headway with the state education department, and it's very frustrating to me, and I'm sure frustrating to you as well. So what information is being shared? It took us a long time to figure this out, and the state kept on saying, oh, we're going to give it to you soon, we're going to give it to you soon, we're going to give it to you soon. Finally, they gave it to us, and then they changed it again. But now we know, because their data dictionary is finally online, it's going to include student names, addresses, emails, phone numbers, test scores, grades, racial and economic status, not just whether you're on free lunch, but whether you receive any form of public assistance, your child's disability diagnosis, your child's 504, which in case you don't know can be a variety of health conditions ranging from allergies to epilepsy, and attendance and disciplinary data, including suspension records. Now, even in those districts, for example, in Jefferson County, they said they would not share any disciplinary or health data because it was too sensitive with InBloom. And in Illinois, they also said they would not share any health data with InBloom. So not only are we the worst state in the country in terms of still participating in this project, but we're the only ones that have said that health data and disciplinary data is going to be shared. Beyond that, the state is encouraging districts to share even more data with InBloom. And I've asked Ken Wagner, is there any limitation on the type or the amount of data that you believe districts can share with InBloom? And they said absolutely not. Whatever they like, they should be able to share it with InBloom, no matter how sensitive. You know, your child's counseling records. I mean, it just goes way beyond anything imaginable. Now, obviously, if this information leaks out or is misused, it could harm your child's prospects for life. Now, what is InBloom's goal? It's kind of hard for them to ever explain it, and it's hard for me to explain it, but people always ask me, so I might as well tell you. InBloom claims that this project will lead to greater efficiency, data analysis, and integration, and create a vibrant market in personalized learning tools by allowing vendors to data mine the information. So essentially what they mean by that is that instead of your teachers or administrators having to log into lots of different programs, they can log into one program with a data dashboard, and that data dashboard will be interoperable with all these nifty learning tools that they will be able to press on a button and assign to your child. So if they see your child is struggling in math and the child is ELL and perhaps has disciplinary problems, there will magically be a software program that's designed just for that child, and that will be allowed to change over time depending on how that child does on that software program. Ken Wagner has been quoted saying that the service providers' tools and standards will converge in a magic mix that hasn't come together before. A magic mix, can you imagine? Now, in New York City, we're very used to these kinds of promises because a number of years ago, we had a project that cost $80 million. InBloom is, by the way, costing at least $100 million. ARIS was our data dashboard, it cost $80 million in city funds. It was promised to revolutionize education, and there have been many studies and audits which show that it's a complete bust and it's almost never used. And when I crashed that learning camp that was run by the Gates Foundation, I explained this to the woman who was running it, who was running the InBloom project for the Gates Foundation, and I said, you know, we've heard it all before, we don't believe it. And I explained to her about ARIS, and she nodded her head sadly, and then I later found out that she used to work for DOE, and she ran the ARIS project for DOE. Here's something we got from the InBloom videos. They have these promotional videos that are supposed to be so appealing to parents, and they're very shocking and appalling to most parents. This is one of the things where they show what the collection of the data and the data dashboards will do is enumerate all your child's positive and qualifications and characteristics, and somehow allow teachers to sort them and keep a daily tab on their personal qualities and their various characteristics. And if your child is starting to act up or missing class or whatever, there are these warning flags that are supposed to go up. And these are all in the data dashboards that already the school districts have been asked to sign up for. Now, what about security? As you probably know, data clouds are not very secure. They get hacked into all the time. And in a recent survey of IT professionals, 86% said they do not trust data clouds for their more sensitive data. Now, InBloom's security policy, and you can see this on the InBloom website if you go there, says they cannot guarantee the security of the information stored, or that the information will not be intercepted when it is being transmitted. Basically, they come out and say right off the top that they will not be responsible because they know there's no way to protect that data. In April, the personal information of 50 million customers of Living Social was disclosed when an Amazon.com cloud was hacked into, and this data is also being stored on an Amazon.com cloud. And all this, again, is being done without parental notification or consent. Now, what about privacy? You will see that the New York State Education Department repeatedly says this is compliant with FERPA, which is the federal law that regulates privacy. Unfortunately, most people think that that means it's really protected, but the federal law has been rewritten by the U.S. Department of Education. The law has not been changed, but the regulations have been rewritten twice in recent years to encourage this sort of data sharing without parental consent. And there was a lawsuit against the federal government for rewriting the law in such a way that was recently thrown out of court, not on substantive grounds, but because they said the law firm had a lack of standing. And if the very same data was in your child's health care files, your medical files, which often it is because it's disability related or 504 conditions, it would be absolutely illegal to share it with third parties without parental consent, and the person doing that could go to jail. But if the exact same information is in your child's educational records, it supposedly is not against the law to share that without consent. And the same with, there's been very strict rules about child's online usage by the FTC, that if your child goes on an online website, whatever data that they share through that online website, if it's a game or whatever, that cannot be shared without parental consent and cannot be used commercially without parental consent. So I also, and many others, have real problems with the whole concept of data dashboards, especially as they're going to be designed by these companies in SED, which will collect 12 years worth of your child's data going back to the day that they enroll in school. And so that means that every single disciplinary incident, every single struggle that your child has had will be instantly available at the touch of a fingerprint to anyone at the school level, including your child's teacher. Now, why is that inadvisable? There's a tremendous amount of data out there, studies that show that teachers tend to build negative preconceptions of your child in advance if they know a lot of problematic information about them, especially before they've ever met. And that can actually determine the teacher's attitude to your child and become a self-fulfilling prophecy, either in a positive or a negative way. There's a fascinating study that was done by University of California researchers where they gave IQ tests to a class, and then they randomly chose, out of the people who'd taken that IQ test, randomly a bunch of students, and told their teacher that these kids had been predicted through that test to make a big jump in IQ that year. And again, it was randomly selected. There was no basis in fact on this. And the kids who actually made the big jump in IQ that year were the ones that had been randomly chosen, and their teachers had been told that because their teachers gave them more input, more feedback, more attention. And so we really are very worried that kids will get negatively stereotyped and profiled based upon things that happened way back in their past. And as a parent, I was always very glad to know that my son had a new teacher every year and a new chance to make a new impression, and wouldn't be held back by sometimes trivial and sometimes not so trivial things that had happened in their past. So what about the costs? This is another thing the state doesn't like to talk about and tries to sort of bury under the rug. But the truth is that starting 1 year from now, InBloom is going to start charging. They originally said $2 to $5 per student. At the last testimony of the state, they said $3 to $5 per student when asked. But the InBloom said the prices will probably go down as more states join in. And guess what? At this point, more states doesn't look like they're joining in. In fact, more states are pulling out. So that price is likely to go up. And one of the data specialists said, it doesn't make any sense. We're going to be spending money to buy back the data for our students that we gave InBloom for free. This doesn't count the charges of the data dashboard vendors that are also going to start charging in probably a year. The state says they're going to cover some of those charges, perhaps. No, the state says they're going to maybe cover the InBloom charges for a while they still get Race to the Top money, but they expect that money is going to run out. But they're not going to start covering the data dashboard charges, which will start charging in a year. And then nothing compares to the potential costs if this data breaches in terms of legal liability, which could open up the state to multi-hundred-million-dollar class action suits. And also, InBloom says it's not selling the data, but exploring charging vendors for access to the data. This is just a sample of the kinds of things we found on the InBloom website, the kinds of data that they're collecting. You can see a lot of very personal stuff in there, including foster care, economic disadvantage, developmental delayed learning styles, program participations, 504 disabilities. 75% of school board members in a recent survey say they think they're opposed to this project. 78% say that they think parents should be able to opt out. 50 assembly members, I just got the letter today, have signed a letter to the commissioner expressing their concern. Senator Flanagan has called for a 1-year moratorium on sharing data. At least 40 superintendents are giving back their Race to the Top funds, but still their data is going to be shared anyway. This is about the bills that were passed last year by the Assembly to allow opt-out and consent. Both of them have been resubmitted in the Senate, and Senator Flanagan has his own bill that now he's introduced, but it would not allow for parental consent or opt-out. This is the relationship between InBloom and the Common Core. Because this meeting was about the Common Core, I thought I'd bring that up. InBloom sold itself as helping with achieve the Common Core. Obviously, if you have uniform tests and test score data across the country, it becomes much easier and much more useful to aggregate multi-state databases. The federal government has put a lot of money to given states to create longitudinal cradle to the grave data systems where they will state agencies will share it among state agencies. And this is something that you can find that the federal government claims not to be interested in collecting personal student data. The agreement of the two testing consortia, one called PARC, one called Smarter Balance, that are doing the Common Core tests, and New York is supposed to has joined into PARC, though we're not sure when that's going to start. It clearly says in their agreement with the federal government that the grantee, meaning PARC, must provide timely and complete access to any and all data collected at the state level to the U.S. Department of Education. So that looks to me like at some level the federal government does or did want to collect all this data itself. So this is just the, Common Core, watch out, Uncle Sam wants your data, and then happy holidays. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. Does Santa work for InBloom? Thank you very much.
Leonie, thank you.
Can I ask you a couple questions? Can I ask you a couple questions?
Sure.
All right. My understanding is if you use 8 points of data, that's all you need to identify a child. And I further understand that what New York is looking to collect is over 400 points of data. Is that true?
That's true. It's more than 400. The state says it's less, but it's actually more, because every single course they take is a separate point, and they only count it once.
Okay. And, well, most of that's unnecessary for actually tracking a child, his educational experience.
The superintendents and principals I've talked to say they don't want any part of this. They don't think any of it's necessary. Even the ones that have their own data dashboards, they don't think that this is necessary.
All right. Can you tell me who the parent company is for InBloom?
The parent company, it's actually a separate corporation now.
But is it an affiliate of Gates Foundation?
No, it was founded with $100 million of the Gates Foundation. It is a separate nonprofit corporation with a separate board. Most of the board members either work for the Gates Foundation or who are grantees of the Gates Foundation.
Okay. And we already went through, it's $5, $10 per student that would be paid to this foundation.
$3 to $5 to InBloom Inc., which is a nonprofit corporation. At first, it could go up.
All right. And now InBloom, now this not-for-profit corporation, I've heard that we have fellows that are actually working for the state ed department?
Absolutely. So the Regents Fellows are funded in part by the Gates Foundation, and the Regent Fellow, that one of them is in charge of the InBloom project, and his name is Amrit Singh. And we found his name on emails to the Louisiana State Superintendent, luring him into InBloom while he was working at the Regents.
Okay. But right now we have some of these Regents Fellows that are being paid in the State Department of Education.
Right.
And we have other regions that are actually serving in a capacity for the Education Committee for the Assembly. Is that true? Do you know?
There are Regent Fellows working under John King, is that what you're saying?
John King, but they're also embedded in the
State Education.
The State Education Committee for the Assembly. Do you know anything about that?
They're working for the State Education Committee?
What? No.
I didn't know that.
We have
the Assembly Committee?
The Assembly Committee.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
I have no
I'm just wondering,
knowledge.
because I had a debate over that at the end of session, and one of the questions I asked was whether or not anyone working as our staff in the Education Committee actually had experience in the classroom. And the term fellows came out, so I was just wondering if you looked at that, if you knew that we had any fellows working in the Education Committee that we should be looking at.
Not that I know.
All right. Now, did you say Flanagan's bill would not have the option to opt out for parents?
That's right. What he says is he's going to, needs to be a privacy officer that will develop a parental bill of rights, but he will be appointed by the commissioner and work under the commissioner. And right now, we have no confidence that this commissioner would ever allow a parental opt-out or consent. And in fact, the spokesperson for the state education department has said that when you enroll your child in a public school, a parent loses all rights to control that child's data.
Okay. And lastly, I know that my school district, which is Sachem, their stuff was put out, students' information was put out on the internet. And matter of fact, I got 3 letters from my children, and my son's 29, and his data went out there. And I understand there's one individual I know that has an IEP, and his IEP was put out on the website. It was taken down, but, and now you said this was a wireless service? Is that what
So
you're saying?
there's a company called Wireless Generation, and it had several big contracts with the Department of Education in New York City, but also around the country. When Joel Klein resigned as chancellor in New York City, Rupert Murdoch bought up Wireless Generation and made Joel Klein the head of it's called now Amplify, which is the educational products division of News Corporation, which is owned and run by Rupert Murdoch. So the operating system of InBloom is run by a subsidiary of the News Corporation. And in fact, if you go to the contract between the state and InBloom, which was then called the Shared Learning Collaborative, the privacy and security policy is controlled by Wireless Generation, which is rather strange. So we have a lot of questions about that as well.
All right, my last question. The fellows that I understand that are working for the state education department, and they're helping to write policy for the state ed, they are not paid by the state, correct? They're
Correct,
paid,
private funds.
and they're being paid by the this foundation, correct?
There are several different foundations that have given money, and the Gates Foundation is one of the largest.
Okay, but they're working inside the building for the New York State Department of Education,
Yes,
but then none of them are on the payroll for New York State.
that's true.
Thank you.
Leonie, thank you. Thanks for joining us and learning as we go along here. Thank you so much. In terms of the data transmission, and I've heard some families and parents talk about it, what's the status of the transmission of data?
So this is a story that's very disturbing, and it's only coming out in drips and drabs, but as far as we know now, there was a lot of data that was uploaded last December to allow and help InBloom for its infrastructure development. In other words, for it to build its product, they uploaded real data. We don't know exactly what. And then they uploaded a lot of data, including personally identifiable data, including the state unique student ID number in July to help with the data portal roadshows. So these companies that are selling their data dashboards, one of them is Pearson, one of them is EduScholar, and one of them is another company, I forget, went around the state to sell their products to district officials. And instead of using dummy data, which would have been very, very easy for them to do, they actually uploaded real live student data and allowed people to see that. Just people, I guess, walking through the data roadshows. But they haven't uploaded the names yet. I asked Ken Wagner if they uploaded addresses, phone numbers, the rest, and he said he didn't think so, though he's been asked this question a million times and he doesn't really answer any time. But so we have a lawsuit that was filed in court a few weeks ago, and we had to delay it a little bit because our attorneys found more ways in which the state education department was breaking the law. And so now the hearing in court is January 3rd, and we wanted to delay it a little bit more because we have to respond to their papers, and it's going to be hard to get the response between Christmas and New Year's. But they said no more delays because we cannot put off uploading the names and everything else beyond January 15th. We won't delay any further beyond January 15th. We're asking for an immediate injunction. We have no idea whether we're going to get it or not, but we pray we will.
So in essence, so either court action or legislative action, adopting and passing legislation before January 15th.
Absolutely. I would love it if legislation was passed that, was good legislation before then. I don't know what the chances are, really. I mean, I think I would love every legislator to get in touch with the regions in particular and John King and tell them to put a moratorium on it at least so that there can be discussions and something can be worked out. And that's one of the things that Senator Flanagan has done. I think, even a 6-month moratorium would be advisable. But at this point, I don't know that they listen to anybody. I mean, you would think they would, but I haven't seen any sign of it. And so they've gone around the state. I'm sure you've seen the videos. Parents bring this up all the time. They boo and they hiss, and the same answers come back every time that, we're protecting your data, we care about your privacy, but, we need to do this. We need to do this.
Thank you, Leonie.
Can I just ask? I guess two quick questions. You mentioned in your slides the 2 bills that the Assembly passed last year that are awaiting action in the Senate, and I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more, just your feelings on how far those would go towards addressing some of these issues, as opposed to basically passing a bill or, state ed just pulling out of this completely.
Well, I think both bills that were passed in the Assembly, and they were also submitted in the Senate and got good bipartisan support in the Senate as well, would stop InBloom one way or the other. The first bill blocks redisclosures without parental consent, which is what InBloom was designed to do. It would allow the continuation of certain of the vendors that school districts say that they do already. I'm not sure that they really need to do all that stuff that they do without consent, but they say that they do. So this bill was very carefully designed to stop redisclosures without parental consent, and also to require full liability on the part of any company that allows for breaches, so that InBloom would be responsible if anything happened. And the second bill would allow parental opt-out of any third-party vendor sharing. And I think that we could really make sure that enough parents opted out of the InBloom scheme to make the whole process probably so unattractive to InBloom that they wouldn't even want to go through with it, because so many people would be opting out. And they really want a full data set. So I think both bills are good bills, and I would encourage, them to be resubmitted and passed.
Yeah, I believe they both passed unanimously, so I'm sure they will have no trouble passing unanimously again next year, especially given the renewed and continued public attention on this. But I just wanted to ask you that question, just, whether those bills might be sufficient to do what we needed to do, or whether more was needed if we could, get those enacted into law. But I think it does sound like they would go far enough in really frustrating the purpose of things that it would kind of almost force InBloom to take a step back, because it wouldn't be worth their while. They wouldn't be getting the data that they need to do what they're looking to do with it.
Right. Our lawsuit, it turns out there's a very good state law already on the books that's never been complied with by the state education department, and most people didn't even know it existed, called the Personal Privacy Protection Law, that was passed in 1984, and it has very strong protections on all kinds of data that collected by the state. Any state agency has to require consent unless the sharing of this data is necessary or specifically authorized by law. And in this case, we don't think it's either necessary or authorized by law. So, there's all sorts of other stuff in the law about that the state has to have a chief privacy officer. Every agency has to appoint one, and has to put out a privacy impact study every year if there's any change in how they're sharing data. The state education department has never complied with this since the law was passed in 1984.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this. This is extremely helpful, and it's so great to match a name with a face. So
Yes, thank
really
you.
appreciated this, and thanks again to my colleagues for holding this. I have found this extremely helpful, and I do regret that I have a concert for my son that I have to leave for. Just a couple of just clarifying questions, because I was at the hearing held last month on this in the Assembly. And at that time, I thought there were still a couple of states left, but you mentioned all the states that have pulled out. At this point, is New York State the only state working with InBloom, or is there still another that, or two that are still working with
So
them?
Massachusetts was going to share data for one district, Everett, Mass. And there was a lot of furor and protest and organized resistance. And they have not formally pulled out, but they say they have no plans to share data anytime soon. So what we hear from the state advocates and the state board is that it's not going ahead. They're not going to necessarily embarrass InBloom by announcing it, but they have no plans to go ahead with it. In Illinois, it's a little bit similar in which there are 35 districts that they're allowing to share data with InBloom if they so choose, but they're not going to make them return race to the top funds if they don't. And we don't really know whether any of them will go ahead and do it. We don't think it's likely that they'll do it at this point. Every other state that I know of has completely pulled out.
Okay, and you do think the couple of bills that have passed would go far enough in helping to derail as much of this as possible?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. The research fellows you mentioned, I share some of the concerns about where that is going. I wasn't aware that there might be one already in the Assembly working there. But can you just comment in general on the research fellows and if that's part of the problem here? Many of us at the table have raised concerns about the implementation of the Common Core overall, along with the testing. Is that part of the issue here, that this has been driven by the research fellows and kind of?
Well, you know, you can't listen to John King very long without realizing that he is a true believer. I have no doubt that he believes in what he's doing is right, but I do believe at the same time that a lot of this is being driven by the Gates Foundation, which has put hundreds of millions of dollars into the Common Core and is giving the state education department millions of dollars, not just for the Regents Fellows, but I think has given them over $15 million in the last few years for a number of programs and projects. So they are very much ideologically aligned. I do not believe that the money is completely irrelevant to the fact that they you know, I can only suspect that part of their resistance to pulling out may be because of all the money that they've gotten from the Gates Foundation, and who knows how much money they are being promised at this point, but if they don't pull out, because right now, if New York State pulled out, this $100 million project by the Gates Foundation would go completely bust. So I think there's tremendous pressure on them probably not to pull out. I find the whole mixing of private money very disturbing. This is happening in New York State, it's happening around the country, and it's ways that private billionaires get to have their education agendas implemented with very little public knowledge and support. And it's a way of really getting around our democratic system.
Thank you, and again, Just one quick question. I don't want to. Just a quick question. Your PowerPoint, I found it very helpful. Is that available online, or is that
Sure.
accessible?
Well, I just finished it today on the train, but I can easily send it to you. So.
Okay. If we could, that'd be really helpful.
I have-
Thank you so much,
yeah,
and thank you
sure.
again, Steve and others,
Thank
for
you so
holding
much
this.
for having
Much
me. I really
appreciated.
appreciate it.
Yep. Lane,
Oh, okay, great.
just a couple questions. The Department of Education, they're collating all this information from the school district, go to them for collation before it goes to InBloom?
That's my understanding. It gets sent to the RISCs, what are they called? The Regional Information Center, the RICs and the BOCES. The RICs and the BOCES, and then the RICs and the BOCES upload it to the InBloom cloud.
Okay. Do they share that with any intrastate interest, like the regions or the committees on education for the Senate, the Assembly, or just they send it out? They just goes to InBloom?
As far as I know, it's going to InBloom, and InBloom is sending it to the data dashboard companies. So it's traveling many, many miles through the internet. So the data dashboards are supposed to collect the data through the internet from the InBloom cloud. Now, school districts who already have some of these data dashboards say, we just input the data ourselves into the data dashboards. The companies don't even get access to it, but even if they did, it would be only temporarily if there was a virus or something. But even so, the transmission would just be from the district to the data dashboard companies. Now it's going from the district to the RICs, to the InBloom cloud, from the InBloom cloud back to the data dashboard companies, and then to the districts. And every time you transmit that data through the internet, there are more and more chances of breaches. And it makes no sense. It makes no sense.
Well, when there's a collection of data, there's usually a reason for that data to achieve a goal, an understanding of an outcome or a direction. Is there a goal at the end of this, or did they give it to a certain group to give recommendations or evaluate what this means in terms of better educational outputs? And
Well, right now, they say that the data dashboards are the main focus, which is, you know, these things that teachers can look at in the classroom or principals can look at. But the ultimate goal of InBloom, as I said, was to create a market and personalized learning tools, which means that they wanted to give this data to as many vendors as possible in an easily digestible form to help them create their commercial products that would then be sold back to schools.
okay.
And all this personal data would somehow help these companies build their products better.
But it doesn't preclude others from getting it, for using it for any other reason other than educational purposes, really.
Well, you know, my view is that these companies are in there to make money, and they're not in there for purely educational purposes. But you see, it's illegal to share this information for commercial purposes without parental consent, but the state education department says it's not commercial, it's educational.
Leonie, just real quick, I have one question for you, but then I want to just ask anybody in the audience, if you have a question for Leonie, maybe just sort of kind of stand up, raise your hand, kind of speak loudly enough for everyone to hear you. I don't know if anybody has questions specifically for Leonie, but first I want to thank you very much, Leonie. That was fantastic information. My question for you is, you had asked a very specific question of the Deputy Commissioner of Education, right, Ken Wagner? You asked him about what data had been uploaded, and he had no answer for you, or he could not tell you what had been uploaded. Is that correct?
All he would say is that no names had yet been uploaded, as far as he knew. And then I said, what about addresses? And he said, I don't think so. And then I said, what about disabilities? And he said, I don't know.
Okay. Does it seem plausible to you at all that the Deputy Commissioner of Education of the state of New York would not know what is being uploaded?
I don't know, but he's been asked this question so many times that he should have found out the answer.
Well, the reason I ask that is that many of us were at that education forum in Albany a few weeks ago, and many in the audience were at that education forum, and I specifically asked them about a data breach, and we talked about Sachem. I said, what happens, what's the ramifications of this if the data is breached? And I got the same answer. So I just want that on record, that we have a deputy commissioner, and I know they're watching, so I just want to speak directly to the camera. We have a deputy commissioner that has no idea what's going on with our student data in the state of New York. Or that's what he's telling us, that he has no idea. I think the likelihood is that he knows exactly what's being uploaded and is just not sharing that information with the people of New York. But Leonie, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. Leonie wrote up here from New York City. We're very glad we didn't hold this forum yesterday. But Leonie, thank you so much. Does anybody have a question for Leonie?
Yeah, one.
Okay.
The money for the storage, the data storage? The $3 to $5, that is being paid by the school districts, correct?
I
Or is
think
it
the
the state?
state is going to cover the charges for InBloom, at least They hope to cover it until sometime in 2015, and then the money's going to run out. They say they hope to get enough Race to the Top funds renewed so that somewhere in the middle of 2015, that money's going to run out. But they weren't sure, and that's another thing which they've been very ambiguous on. They said pretty clearly the districts are going to have to start paying for the data dashboards in a year. And if they don't want to pay for the data dashboards in a year, they can pull out of the data dashboards, but they can't ever pull their data out of InBloom. The only one who can ever pull the data out of InBloom for the entire state is John King.
Okay, well, here's the problem with that. We were also told that the amount of money paid for the evaluations that the governor wanted the schools to pay for, that the state would pay for that. However, it was never put in the budget. So the schools never got reimbursed for that payment. So, I have a real problem when I'm being told that the school districts aren't going to be able or be made to eat this fee.
All right, the Common Core is a huge unfunded mandate that is being put on districts.
Okay, thank you.
Laney, thank you. I think we have a question for you. Yeah.
No.
Short and sweet. Yes.
I was wondering, I signed up on your sheet to get emails. Can you email us your outline here?
Sure. Yeah, I'll put it up on them on my website too, if you're interested.
Yes, sir.
Are you aware that the FERPA and FERPA, have been rewritten 3 times in the last 3 years to include some of the people that have this data available? And the phrase that I remember was reading about business associates. Are you familiar with this area?
I'm familiar with FERPA being rewritten. I'm not familiar with HIPAA. It's called, in FERPA, it's called authorized agents. Yeah, so contractors or authorized agents are allowed to get the data without parental consent. There's no limitation that I know of. As long as the state or the district agrees and it's for a specific educational purpose that can be called educational, yeah, there's no limitation. It's when FERPA was passed by the federal government, it was a very strong privacy law. It was one of the strongest privacy laws that we have. And then it was completely rewritten twice, under George Bush and then again under Obama, and now it's almost meaningless. I agree. It's unbelievable.
Thank Jim for being here this evening. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thanks, everybody.
Any other questions for Laney? No? Yes.
So what we were told was Race to the Top money, the state was mandated somewhere within that edict of getting that money, that they have to come up with this data mining.
So that, again, is a misinformation put out by the State Education Department. What was required is a state longitudinal data system, which in every other state is internally run by the state. And there was no mention of giving any data to third parties or InBloom in either the Race to the Top provisions or in the state's application and grant award from the federal government. There's no necessity for this.
So how, I'm not sure how it goes as far as whether it's in bloom or whatever, mode it's going to win, but basically,
The whole thing is insane because we don't even know if the data portals are going to work. Because this is the first try of InBloom. You know, we're the only state doing this. It's never been tried before. It could be months before the data portals even work. And then the money runs out next December. But InBloom gets to keep the data. I mean,
left because we were earmarked the money to do some other things with it. So in our district, it was like $250,000 3 years ago. We were told how to use it. We used it. Now we have to come up with the money that someone input the stuff in. And then we're also told after that's done, after you put it in, you got any money left, you don't have to use it.
yeah, and for districts who gave their money back who aren't going to use it. They're giving their money back, but their data is still going up into InBloom anyway, and what's the purpose of that?
Yep.
They can't explain, except that, you know, InBloom and the Gates Foundation want the data. And it's very powerful. Data is very powerful. It's worth huge amount of money to companies and to the Gates Foundation because they can do all sorts of research. I think their original goal was going to have a multi-state, really a national database. They were going to be able to do all sorts of fantastic things, including do, you know, national evaluations of teachers as they moved across state lines to make it difficult for them to get jobs elsewhere if they lost their job in one state. But, you know, as now we're the only state left in there, it's becoming less and less plausible to even imagine what the possible goal of the Gates Foundation could be. But they are insisting.
Leonie, thank you. Appreciate it very much. I know that went a little long, but totally worth it, right?